Okay, it's 1:02, so we'll look at kicking off. Kia ora everyone, good afternoon, no mai haere mai and happy new year. Just checking that you could all hear me. If you can hear me, can you raise your hand, please? There we go. Okay, brilliant, fantastic. And everyone can see the screen okay? Keep your hands up if you can see the screen. Yeah, cool. Okay, we'll kick off. Kia ora. Look, welcome to everyone here today. It's great to have you all here to learn a bit more about the Big Picture workshop program. So look, I'm Alicia Mackay and I'm really excited to talk to you all about this one. I'm actually running 2 of these workshops in the South Island this week, and they are shaping up to be really incredible. So one really consistent thing that I've noticed doing organisational strategy work over the last few years is just how difficult it is to talk about how we want to deliver services or how to run our organisations when we're still kind of fuzzy on the big picture. So in particular, I think it's challenging when we've all got kind of different ideas about what that big picture actually is. And there's some great data from the performance information reviews that the SSC did a couple of years ago around, the data's actually around staff engagement, and it points out that when public sector staff are connected to purpose and to the big why, they're much more engaged at work. And that's great, and that actually public sector staff are significantly more engaged and connected to purpose than a lot of our private sector counterparts. But what's really fascinating about that data is that when you dig a layer deeper and you actually ask about what that big picture looks like and what that purpose is, the diversity of answers is quite fascinating. So yeah, we're all really connected to why, except that we've all got different ideas about what that why really is. So when we haven't been able to make the space to hash out those important conversations, and we haven't got that clarity of direction from the top, it's really easy to end up in the kind of situation that we're in at the moment. So I'd love to start with a question actually to gauge where we're at. Look, if I was to spend the morning, hypothetically, if I was spending the morning in the elevator of your building, and I was to catch each of your execs, so everyone in your tier 2s or your tier 3s, if I caught all of your execs kind of one by one in the elevator to ask about the big picture, the overall purpose of your organisation and where you're heading in the next few years, do you think they'd all give me the same answer? Just pop yes in the chat box if you think that they would. Right. Okay, and follow-up question to that. Do you think that everyone in your leadership team at the moment is on the same page, roughly? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. So not really. So look, obviously, while it's really important that our managers and our leaders are well equipped to drive performance inside their own teams, and that is really important, if we don't have that alignment at the top table, it's really difficult to move the whole team or the whole organisation forward in a cohesive direction. So just quickly, here's how today's going to run. I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so looking at why it's really important that we make the space and time to concentrate on the big picture on a regular basis, why it's hard to do that, and answering your questions as we go through, and I've got a few through already, which is great, about the way that this program works to tackle some of those challenges. So as we go through, I would love for you to pop any questions that you have about what I'm talking about, any comments or any questions about the program, just pop them into the chat box or into the Q&A. You can respond to me by using the chat box that we just used, which is great, or you can submit a question on the Q&A format. Everyone cool with that? I'll get you to hit the raise hand icon if you're okay with that. Awesome. Okay, it looks as though everything is working exactly as it should. So I've got the wonderful Nikki with me on the webinar today. Nikki's new to the team, so welcome to Nikki. Nikki is the Relationships and Programs Manager here at Team Mackay. So she handles all of your booking and setup details and generally just sort of makes sure that you're well looked after. So those of you who've already got your dates penciled in will be familiar with Nikki already. If we have any technical issues as we track through, she'll also be able to help us out. So if you're hoping to set up a one-on-one or you have any questions, she can help you with that as well. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, guys.
Hi, nice to have you here today. So any questions at all, guys, just chuck those in the chat box and Nikki will look after you. So I'm going to talk about some of the challenges we've got around the strategic planning stuff and how the big picture chats can make a big difference. We've got about 40 minutes and I will get through all of the information and questions that I can in that time. I'm going to move quite quickly and I'm going to speak quite quickly because that's how I roll. So this might not totally land with you all the first time. If it doesn't, that's cool. Take notes, take in what you can, and I will also make a recording available via email. So if you want to go back and visit, you can do that as many times as you need to. All right, let's get into it. So something that I hear a lot, and I reckon anyone who's attended any kind of conference at all in the last 5 years or so will have been hearing non-stop, is about change. The pace of it, the scope of it, the scale of it, and we're facing it from all angles, right? I mean, socially, the expectations are different, our communities are different, and they're asking for different things from us. So we need to care about things that we kind of didn't have to care about 5 or 10 years ago. And they're important things, but we do need to figure out what that looks like. Economically, the future of work is at the forefront, I think, of any senior leader's mind in the public sector at the moment, both thinking about the impact more broadly on the economy and on the public, but also inside our own teams and our own organisations. So what is going to happen to our work? How's technology going to change not only the way that we deliver services, but the things that we ask people to do when they come to work? Politically, we're seeing big shifts in New Zealand and across the developed world. So people have different expectations of their politicians and of their government, and politicians have different expectations of us as servants. So all of that social and economic uncertainty is driving different attitudes toward government and what our role is in providing public goods and meeting those needs. And this changing political context is more our problem than it ever has been before. So that distinction between political rhetoric and the bureaucracy, it's squeezing, it's tighter, and the impact of the international political environment on the stuff that we're doing here in New Zealand is more significant than before. So in a globally interconnected world, kind of pulling one string can unravel the whole jumper. And so thinking about what that means for us if there's conflict between the US and China, how we're affected by that changing economic power balance, by resource scarcity. Just this week, we've got a rapid outbreak pandemic in Asia with coronavirus, and what was required of our government in terms of the speed of response is that it needs to be fast, it needs to be effective. We've got to have people at airports, we've got to have a policy position on this, we need comms. And so this stuff is happening fast because all of these issues, while they're not new, are traveling much quicker than they ever before. So we've got more pressure to take really serious coordinated action, not just on that external stuff, but on things like climate change and sustainability, on the way that we understand transport, housing, communication, work, education, health. The whole lot kind of feels like it's up for debate at the moment. We've got public sector reform on the cards, which will transform the way that we plan and deliver change in services right across government. So the expectation is that we're going to work collaboratively and effectively cross-agency and in partnership with the social and private sectors. But I mean, we've got teams at work who can't work collaboratively and effectively across the office. So what we need to do internally to start preparing for some of the requirements of reform is going to be a big ask, I think, in some agencies. So look, I'm pretty skeptical about the fear-mongering that comes with a lot of these conversations around change and disruption. I mean, if we look back over the last few hundred years in the context of all of those things, whether that's social, economic, political, global, senior leaders in government have been managing a heavy load and have been managing change on all of those fronts for as long as government has existed. Change is not new. It is our core business, and it's going to stay that way. The trick here is moving beyond that sense of total overwhelm, I think, that comes with these kind of chats, and connecting the dots, picking a position, getting clear about the potential meaning of these shifts as best we can, and making a decision about what we need to focus on in our zone to have the public impact that we come to work to make. Which makes a lot of sense and it sounds good, but it's scary to do, right? You know, picking a position in a political environment, in a really visible environment, when we've got incomplete information, we've got imperfect information, or when we've got no idea what the future holds, that stuff is scary. But the alternative is that we put our heads in the sand and we do nothing, which is a hell of a lot worse, because when we understand what we're facing and we choose how to manage it, we can always change that management approach as other things shift and we get new information. But when we take the ostrich approach and we ignore it entirely, we don't get to opt out of the future. We're just choosing to have no input in the way that we relate to it and create meaning from it. So, I mean, it's kind of like a KiwiSaver fund, I think. You know, you can choose a passive or an active management strategy, or you can opt out entirely. And when you opt out, we do ourselves out of any potential gains in the first place. And that's kind of what this stuff is like. The thing about taking that kind of approach, though, and choosing to step up and say, right, look, we've got a lot of change going on. We're going to respond to our context, and here's the position that we're going to take, that this is what we think, is that it depends on a certain level of agreement or alignment about what that is. So it's not enough to just have our minister or the board or the chief executive or just a few individual DCEs or senior leaders deciding what those critical inflection points are and where our focus areas need to be. That's how you get a patchwork quilt of plans, not a cohesive big picture strategy. Has anyone ever known a family where the kids were really good at playing the parents off against each other? Raise your hand if you've observed a family where the kids are really good at playing the parents off against each other to get what they want. Yeah, I think this is really common in separated families as well. And so, you know, if you don't get the answer you need from one parent, change your tack. You might get it from the other. Teenagers are particularly good at this, actually. Keep your hands up if you have seen similar behaviour in your workplace. Yeah, and that's really easy to do when the leadership team, and whether that's your board or your exec or your parents, aren't on the same page about the important stuff, right? And it's not that differences in style or service delivery are particularly important, but more that there are some really critical pillars that we need to see agreement on. So in your family, that might be discipline style or screen time or money stuff. But at work, that's what does our big picture look like and how are we going to tackle it? So I work with a team in local government who use a phrase that I really like. They talk about half conversations. Put your hand up if you think you know what I mean when I say half conversations. Yeah, so the idea behind half conversations is that the stuff that's said in the room is only half of the story, right? Either because we don't have the time to get really stuck into the why, or because we don't make the space to ask a bigger question, or because we're just not comfortable having the full version of that conversation. And like half conversations are sometimes really necessary. We can't get all meta and contemplative every time there's a decision to make. No one's got time for that. The problem is that for that to work, we kind of need to have made the time and space at an earlier point to bypass that agony. So who's ever been in a team or worked for a leadership team who's gone around in circles every time they've had to make a decision? Okay, most of us. Yeah, and it's ironic really, because we end up in the situation where, because we're too busy wasting time on every decision we have to make, we don't have time to do the big picture thinking that would make those decisions easier. And so if we actually took the time to really think about what we're doing and where we're going, we might find that we'd be able to get rid of half of those issues or service lines or projects that are causing us the headaches in the first place, because we'd realise that they didn't align with our vision for the future or our position on those big issues. So instead we get stuck in the weeds, we're in an operational loop, we're focusing on the now, we're really blinded kind of by what's right in front of us, the way things are, and it's really hard to see that we shouldn't even be even having half of those half conversations in the first place. So pretty much every team I work with talks to me about those two things, the overly operational focus and about organizational silos. So when I talk about silos, I mean people inside the leadership team who are heads down, bums up, focusing on what's happening in their own teams. And when that happens, and we don't take that space, we not only don't have the alignment between the leadership team, so internally between ourselves, but because we're so focused on what's happening in our teams and in the business, we're not working on the business, and we're definitely not focusing on what's happening outside of it. Because when it comes to senior leadership, there are three potential ways that we can spend our time and our energy. And the way that we do that should be shifting according to what level we are inside the organization. So I like to think of it as the more senior we are, the more important it is to make that space and time. It is literally our job. And when we don't do that, when we're sitting up the top here in that organizational general level up the top there, and we're fiddling around in the operational technical stuff down the bottom, we're not operating at our pay grade and we're not delivering on the things that we're paid for. So when we think about senior public leadership and we look at those top two levels, organizational and general leadership, you see that the bulk of our time should be spent on the business. So that's the strategy, planning, systems leadership. And as you really get to that kind of tier 2 or maybe tier 3 inside a really big agency, as we get to that general level, we should also be spending a significant proportion of our time and energy focusing on what's happening outside. And very, very minimal time and energy on what's happening at an operational level. I am constantly astonished at how little executive teams seem to know what is happening outside of their buildings. And not even the big picture, external world politics type stuff. I mean, just what's happening across the road or in a different building. And for some bizarre reason, this actually seems to be worse in the public sector than with the private and third sector clients that I work with. I mean, it is baffling. We are talking about a sector where there is, in theory, very little competition, where all the information is publicly accessible, where we've got extremely similar counterparts at every level, whether that's other councils for local government, other states, other countries, other agencies, who are grappling with the same stuff that we are. And yet, despite all of that, and despite all of the dedicated groups and forums that are set up as well for us to network, I consistently walk into workshops and say things, and I'm told, no, that's not relevant, that won't work here, that's not an option, you can't do that. And I have to say, well, I'm literally working with 3 other places that are doing this right now, and get those surprised faces in response. And it kind of goes to show that driving alignment on that big picture is pretty much impossible if you don't have a leadership team who are connecting the dots to their external operating environment. But look, none of this stuff happens by accident. Strategy needs space. And the kind of big picture direction setting and alignment that we're talking about here, this isn't like an annoying obligation that's getting in the way. This isn't a nice to have or a luxury. If you are a member of a leadership team, this is actually your job. So taking the time to evaluate your context, to think about the big choices you're facing, the direction that you guys need to head in, what that shared sense of purpose is, it doesn't happen by accident. And like these leadership levels, like these leadership levels here, the more senior your position, the more strategy space you need. And in fact, the more you create, the more successful you're likely to be. So when we're looking at that big picture stuff, the thinking, the chatting, the planning, all that strategic stuff at the executive level, that's where you should be spending a good 20 to 40% of your time. And so when it comes to all of this stuff, it's not the luxury stuff, it's not the esoteric intangible, this would be nice if we were able to navel gaze and think about our context and think about the future. Actually, the value is much clearer than that, particularly at those top couple of levels. And the value is very clear as soon as we start to undertake those 4-year plans, long-term plans, medium and long-term planning processes. We get better, faster decisions when we do a good job of the big picture. So when it comes to making decisions and running our planning processes, it's an awful lot easier when we've got clarity on what our big picture issues and outcomes are. And we know that. Anyone who's ever walked into one of those long-term planning sessions understands that. But on the most basic level, we make better, faster decisions when we've taken the space and time, not just in a formal planning process or a meeting environment, but actually on the fly and when we're responding to unexpected change. So the irony about facing the kind of uncertain environment that we're facing is that it's actually more important than ever that we're clear and certain about what we need to achieve. Otherwise, we find ourselves responding to things in a really ad hoc, reactive way that doesn't necessarily get us any closer to our goals. Which brings me to my next point, actually, because it's not just about speed and it's not just about quality here, about decisions. It's about value and it's about public value. So when we spend our time and money more strategically, because we've got clearer direction, that's how we do our jobs as providers of the public good. So with that clarity, we can be more confident in our ability to drive outcomes for our organisations and for our public, because we know that we're focusing on the stuff that we've agreed is the most important. So that means that we're offering better bang for our buck, not just in the way that we spend our budgets either, or the things that we build or the stuff that we offer, but the way that we spend our attention. So the public sector wage bill is the most significant line item that we've got in the public books, right? So for many of you, it will be the biggest bill that your agency has to pay, particularly policy shops, right? And we may not be tracking our time in 7-minute increments like a law firm or measuring the profit per employee, but that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to deliver the most value possible out of the way that we spend our time. And I think that gets overlooked. And the other massive way that we get value out of having a good structured process for these conversations is about that strategic aligned leadership. So it's about getting out of the weeds, doing the job that we're paid to do, and coming together on the same page with a shared vision that we can drive through the rest of the organisation. Because unless our leaders have that confidence in that mandate and that direction, they're just not going to be able to make hard decisions and navigate the future in the way that we need them to be genuinely effective. And if we look at the 4 ways that senior leaders deliver value in their role, according to that SSC Leadership Success Profile, that's exactly what we're looking at. We're looking at navigating the future, at managing change, leading people, making it happen. And doing any of that without the big picture vision and clarity is extremely, extremely difficult. So this is all well and good. We need to do this. We've got that. We need to talk about the big picture. But why do you need me? Can't you just do it yourself? I mean, absolutely, you can give it a crack. And if that's the alternative to not having these conversations at all, then please make sure you do this. When you jump off this webinar, I would love for you to be able to get something in the diary as a matter of priority, because there are 3 key principles to this big picture process, and that is the first one: make the space. So unless we deliberately create the time and the place and the headspace to think differently, we end up with tunnel vision. So when we're trapped in a cycle of overwhelm and urgent needs and continuous pressure, we really need that sacred space to get out and think strategically. And so the time, yeah, the headspace, definitely, the physical space. And this is one of the reasons I ask that we don't run these workshops on site unless we have to, because there is something about being in a different environment that just totally shifts the way that we think, which is too important to neglect. So like, I do some of my best thinking on a plane. Other people I know do their best thinking on the train on the way home, or in the garden, or when they're out for a run. The point is that space isn't just about time. It really is about environment. So that's the first principle of this program, and also should be the first principle for you guys if you're looking at making that space in your diary. The second principle for the big picture program is about structure. So in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman uses the phrase, what you see is all there is. And it's this whole idea that we kind of have a tendency not to look for what we don't immediately see. So we kind of take what's in front of us and what we already know, and then we just kind of make a really good story out of it and rock on, which is fine some of the time. But when we're thinking about really important strategic framework stuff, it's a bit of an issue really, because our brains are far more inclined to value a coherent story than an accurate one. And it can make something out of not very much. And then we tend to find ourselves running around finding information that kind of backs up the decisions we've already made or the way that we already think. It's kind of like when you get a new car, and even though you've never seen that model before, all of a sudden they're everywhere. This is like that. You find what you're looking for. And so the problem here obviously is that at the big picture level, we can end up with a very narrow frame and a discussion that focuses in a very specific direction before we've even had the chance to challenge it, because we don't know we're doing it. And so the best way to tackle that is to use a very clear decision structure. And so it's all about challenging those assumptions and finding those gaps in the things that we aren't thinking about. And that's what this program is about. It's about providing a tested, evidence-based structure to widen the frame, test assumptions, identify some of those issues, and bring it all to light. And the third principle inside the big picture program is about challenge. And I think this is probably the key thing that can be particularly difficult to do on your own. So finding the space is doable. The structure is difficult to put together to counteract your own bias, but it's totally doable. The challenge bit is hard. And a shared vision needs to have a lot more than just a good idea, right? Like, who's ever been on one of those boards or teams where somebody will just kind of write a strategy and present it to you? Like, here you are, here is your gift, you are very welcome. It needs a lot more than that to stick, yeah? So we need to be able to wrestle with our thinking and test it and approach it from different angles and have a really good argument about some of this stuff. Because when we don't do that, when we have those half conversations, we don't get the engagement or the buy-in or the skin in the game. And those are the things we actually need from our leaders if we want the stuff to stick when it comes time to make a hard decision. And we need them to believe it when it comes time to lead others. And then even with those things aside, it's actually the only way to really boost the quality of our thinking. It's just to think about all the ways we're wrong and have someone give us a prod. So those three principles are the key underpinnings of that big picture process and the value of having an external facilitator to make it come alive. Now, when it comes to the elements of the program or the process, we've broken it into four quite distinct components. Now, the first part of that is the full day workshop. So this is the guts of the program, and this is kind of where all the magic happens, right? So this is really the detail piece around that structure, the structure principle. There is an important sequence that we need to follow here to really get the value out of those tricky conversations. And it's important that we do it in the order that our brains need to be able to get the results at the other end, right? So we've got a 4-part process that sits inside, and I won't go into too much detail, but the 4-part process for that workshop day is about starting at the top, thinking big. So that's the throwing open the context, widening that frame before we've decided that what we see is all there is and narrowing it down, and identifying all those big shifts. And then the second part of that process is about connecting the dots. So that's our meaning making. It's the so what? Yes, we've identified all the stuff's going on and we've thrown our perspective open and we've found things we didn't see before. But what does that mean for us? What relevance does this have to the decisions that we need to make? So the top level of that wheel is very much about context and about meaning. The third part of that process is where we need to focus. And that's very much about saying, look, we can understand what's going on and what it means for us, but we're still kind of overwhelmed about what we do with that. And so the focus part of that process is about working out where our priorities need to be for action. What would have the most impact? Where do we have the most influence? Where do we most need to throw our resources? And then a final part of that process, step 4, is about being suspicious. And so this is kind of my favorite bit, actually. This is the bit where we argue with each other a little bit. And we try to find all the ways that we might be wrong or that things might go wrong. Because we have a tendency to be quite optimistic when we've got a good plan that we've put together. And particularly if we have been really good and structured and tested it along the way, we tend to get quite optimistic at the end about how fast things are going to happen, how well things are going to go. And despite the fact that history teaches us that that's kind of really how things don't happen at all, particularly in the public sector. So we have a lot of fun in that 4th part around actually doing a bit of a pre-mortem and having a few really good debates. So that's the 4-part process. Now, the way that works in the workshop is quite interesting because it will be slightly different depending on what your team needs and where you're at. So I've had 2 workshop planning chats with clients for this program this week, and they both kind of need opposite things. So the first team, what they're really struggling with, because they've had kind of 12 or 18 months of just heads down, bums up, super BAU, operationally focused stuff going. They've had a lot going on. They really need to just throw the gates open and get their perspective broadens and lift their heads above the parapet and do a lot of that big picture thinking. And so the agenda for that day is really focused on making sure our emphasis is there. Whereas the chat I had this morning, that team has kind of done a lot of that. And it's really important that they test their thinking and they make sure that they're challenging their assumptions and pulling the gaps out. But where they really need to focus and where they're struggling at the moment, where they're feeling overwhelmed, is actually how they bring that back down to ground and how they make decisions about where they should focus and test their thinking around actually, can we do a lot of this and how do we do it? So that will shift depending on where you're at, and there is that flexibility inside the emphasis. The important thing is that all 4 of those components are touched on as part of that process. So we've got our workshop. Workshop is great. The second part of that process is your big picture map. I love this. The big picture map is very cool. It's a beautiful, clear, 1-page summary of all the thinking that you did on that day. So no long, boring, overly justified, full of jargon strategy documents, just a useful, clear summary that you can put on the wall, that you can use in conversations, that you can pull it out again and again as a reference point for what you're focusing on and why that matters. You will also receive some of the background, so what the key arguments we had were, what the sticking points were, what the key risks looked like, and that will be useful background to refer to in decision processes. But the most important keystone and deliverable that comes from this is the map, because we want things we can use, not just stuff we can point to, and useful things, not just nice posters with cogs on them. You know what I mean? So the third part of that process is a remote coaching session a few weeks later, where we get the opportunity to actually work through some of the gaps and some of the niggles and some of the potential kind of implementation queries that might have come up since the workshop, because I think too many away days tend to start and finish inside the room. And what we want is to make sure that what we're doing here is providing the follow-up support to really take your thinking back to work. And the last critical element of the program are that the key templates and exercises that we get and that we use inside the workshop are actually provided to you afterwards. And this is part of that it shouldn't start and finish inside the room thing, where we've got the benefit of making sure that we can continue to apply that thinking and the reasoning behind that thinking around the leadership table in our work, when we're making decisions, when we're putting reports together, and that we can stay consistent in the way that we're doing it. So it's not a come and use a lot of post-it notes and then leave and somebody will bring this day up a year later and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's strategy day. We're very much thinking about, look, let's capture that thinking, let's put it in a usable form, let's follow it up and make sure that we're actually able to do something with it, and let's actually equip ourselves and our team members with the tools that they need to make that a reality. So it's kind of hitting all 4 of those key pain points, I guess, or failure points that I generally see that comes out of one of those big picture days, where it sounds good in theory, but when it comes to grounding it at work, it all feels a bit far away. So we're trying to bring it as close together as possible and narrow that gap between the big picture and the daily activity. Okay, that was a lot in one go. I've been talking non-stop for 40 minutes. I've been seeing your questions come through as we go around process, around what happens in the workshop, about how some of the stuff works, and I think I've tackled most of those. If you've got anything I haven't answered, it would be great for you to chuck it in the chat box now. But I do know with these things, it's pretty common that you leave this environment and then immediately think, oh, I know what I should have asked. And look, that's totally fine. If you've got a few questions that didn't come up here, that do pop up later, I will, first of all, make the recording available to rewatch. So if you wanted to go back over part of the process, that's totally cool. But I'm also happy to chat one-on-one. So feel free to reach out. It is worth saying that this program is not for everyone. So there's a lot of challenge involved. There's a lot of laughter, but there's a lot of challenge and there's a bit of hard work. So this may not be for everyone. We've put aside those 8 dates in March and in April. So My January and February are chocker because I'm running these in local government, which is great. So I tested the water on this one late last year and sent an email out to a bunch of my favourite councils and said, look, here's what I'm seeing for you guys. This is what I think we need to do. What do you reckon? And they were snapped up in a few days, so that's awesome. And the more work I've put into the resources and the games and the process for this program, the more excited I've got about it, I think. And I think the more convinced I am of its importance too. For councils who are the audience for the round one version of this program, I've actually made it mandatory to bring governance into the conversation. So this is particular to the local government setting and kind of where councils are at timing wise. So we've got a brand new council. It came on October, November last year. We've got a 10-year planning process kicking off later this year for long-term plan 21-31. And for these kind of two reasons, it's just so critical that they bring together governance and management. And so if you're in local government, this will be ringing a whole bunch of bells for you. For central government, it is a bit different. And so hopefully this answers your question about involvement in the room. So for central government, it's a bit different. Obviously, if you're a Crown entity and we're talking at an exec team level discussion here, we should absolutely have board involvement. That would make a huge difference, and I really don't think we have enough of that. If you're a business group or a team and there's no obvious governance connection, it would probably be more appropriate to bring in senior leaders from somewhere else in the organisation as that pressure test. Either way, we do need that pressure test. So if it's just like the same old guys hanging out, talking the same stuff, we don't tend to get the same breakthroughs as when we can bring in some of that diversity. So part of that principle around challenge is thinking about who we can bring in, aside from the facilitator, that we know is going to bring a different point of view, that we know is going to disagree or be affected by some of the decisions that we make in the room, so that we've got that test every step of the way. Because when we're sitting in a room full of nodding heads, it's a very dangerous sign. It's generally a sign that either we're having those half conversations or that we just don't have enough challenge to test our thinking. So getting that diversity in the room, getting that representation, if you've got a governance, an obvious governance connection, really important, makes a huge difference. But like, it's a horses for courses thing here. The most important thing is getting that diversity of thinking and making sure that we have the mandate really to move ahead. Because there's nothing more frustrating than having brilliant strategic chats and then realizing when you get back to the office that it's like kind of not up to you. So making sure that we've got those sponsors or those governors or those other key relationships from across the agency in the room, very important. Okay, team. Well, we're at 1:45, so we are at the end of our time together. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been useful. Thank you so much for coming along today. I really appreciate it. If you have more questions, then absolutely, if you're ready to talk bookings and dates, fire us an email. That's info@aliciamackay.co.nz, and Nikki or I will be able to help you out and be in touch with each of you individually to work through the details. So have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your week. E no hora. Kia ora, everyone. Thanks very much.